Marching off the cliff. December 5, 2011. A task of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, now underway in Durban, South Africa, is to extend earlier policy decisions that were limited in scope and only partially implemented. These decisions trace back to the UN Convention of 1992 and the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, which the US refused to join. The Kyoto Protocol's first commitment period ends in 2012. A fairly general pre-conference mood was captured by a New York Times headline, "Urgent Issues but Low Expectations." As the delegates meet in Durban, a report on newly updated digests of polls by the Council on Foreign Relations and the Programme on International Policy Attitudes, PIPA, reveals that publics around the world and in the United States say their government should give global warming a higher priority and strongly support multilateral action to address it. Most U.S. citizens agree, though PIPA clarifies that the percentage has been declining over the last few years, so that American concern is significantly lower than the global average 70% as compared to 84%. Americans do not perceive that there is a scientific consensus on the need for urgent action on climate change. A large majority think that they will be personally affected by climate change eventually, but only a minority thinks that they are being affected now, contrary to views in most other countries. Americans tend to underestimate the level of concern among other Americans. These attitudes aren't accidental. In 2009, the energy industries, backed by business lobbies, launched major campaigns that cast doubt on the near-unanimous consensus of scientists on the severity of the threat of human-induced global warming. The consensus is only near-unanimous because it doesn't include the many experts who feel that climate change warnings don't go far enough, and the marginal group that deny the threat's validity altogether. The standard he says/she says coverage of the issue keeps to what is called balance, the overwhelming majority of scientists on one side, the denialists on the other. The scientists who issue the more dire warnings are largely ignored. One effect is that scarcely one-third of the US population believes that there is a scientific consensus on the threat of global warming, far less than the global average, and radically inconsistent with the facts. It's no secret that the US government is lagging on climate issues. Publics around the world in recent years have largely disapproved of how the United States is handling the problem of climate change, according to PIPA. In general, the United States has been most widely seen as the country having the most negative effect on the world's environment, followed by China. Germany has received the best ratings. To gain perspective on what's happening in the world, it's sometimes useful to adopt the stance of intelligent extraterrestrial observers viewing the strange doings on Earth. They would be watching in wonder as the richest and most powerful country in world history now leads the lemmings cheerfully off the cliff. Last month, the International Energy Agency, IEA, which was formed on the initiative of U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in 1974, issued its latest report on rapidly increasing carbon emissions from fossil fuel use. The IEA estimated that if the world continues on its present course, the carbon budget will be exhausted by 2017. The budget is the quantity of emissions that can keep global warming at the 2 degrees Celsius level considered the limit of safety. IEA chief economist Fatih Birol said, "The door is closing. If we don't change direction now on how we use energy, we will end up beyond what scientists tell us is the minimum for safety. The door will be closed forever." Also last month, the U.S. Department of Energy reported the emissions figures for 2010. Emissions jumped by the biggest amount on record, the Associated Press reported, meaning that levels of greenhouse gases are higher than the Worst-case scenario anticipated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in 2007. John Riley, co-director of the Massachusetts Institute of Technologies, MIT, Program on Climate Change, told the Associated Press that scientists have generally found the IPCC predictions to be too conservative, unlike the fringe of denialists who gain public attention. Riley reported that the IPCC's worst-case scenario was about in the middle of the MIT scientists' estimates of likely outcomes. As these ominous reports were released, the Financial Times devoted a full page to the optimistic expectations that the U.S. might become energy independent for a century, with new technology for extracting North American fossil fuels. Though projections are uncertain, the Financial Times reports, the U.S. might leapfrog Saudi Arabia and Russia to become the world's largest producer of liquid hydrocarbons, counting both crude oil and lighter natural gas liquids. In this happy event, the U.S. could expect to retain its global hegemony. Beyond some remarks about local ecological impact, the Financial Times said nothing about what kind, because we say so, of a world would emerge from these exciting prospects. Energy is to burn, the global environment be damned. Just about every government is taking at least halting steps to do something about the likely impending catastrophe. The U.S. is leading the way backward. The Republican-dominated U.S. House of Representatives is now dismantling environmental measures introduced by Richard Nixon, in many respects the last liberal president. This reactionary behavior is one of many indications of the crisis of U.S. democracy in the past generation. The gap between public opinion and public policy has grown to a chasm on central issues of current policy debate, such as the deficit and jobs. However, thanks to the propaganda offensive, the gap is less than what it should be on the most serious issue on the international agenda today, arguably in history. The hypothetical extraterrestrial observers can be pardoned if they conclude that we seem to be infected by some kind of lethal insanity. Recognizing the unpeople. January 5, 2012. On June 15, 3 months after the NATO bombing of Libya began, the African Union, AU, presented to the UN Security Council the African position on the attack, in reality bombing by their traditional imperial aggressors, France and Britain, joined by the United States, which initially coordinated the assault, and marginally some other nations. It should be recalled that there were two interventions. The first, under UN Security Council Resolution 1973, adopted on March 17, 2011, called for a no-fly zone, a ceasefire, and measures to protect civilians. After a few moments, that intervention was cast aside as the Imperial Triumvirate joined the rebel army, serving as its air force. At the outset of the bombing, the African Union called for efforts at diplomacy and negotiations to try to head off a likely humanitarian catastrophe in Libya. Within the month, the AU was joined by the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and others, including the major regional NATO power Turkey. In fact, the triumvirate was quite isolated in its attacks, undertaken to eliminate the mercurial tyrant whom they had supported when it was advantageous. The hope was for a regime likelier to be amenable to Western demands for control over Libya's rich resources and, perhaps, to offer an African base for the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, so far confined to Stuttgart. No one can know whether the relatively peaceful efforts called for in UN Resolution 1973, and backed by most of the world, might have succeeded in averting the terrible loss of life and the destruction that followed in Libya. On June 15, The African Union informed the Security Council that ignoring the AU for 3 months and going on with the bombings of the sacred land of Africa has been high-handed, arrogant, and provocative. The African Union went on to present a plan for negotiations and policing within Libya by AU forces, along with other measures of reconciliation to no avail. The African Union call to the Security Council also laid out the background for their concerns. Sovereignty has been a tool of emancipation of the peoples of Africa who are beginning to chart transformational paths for most of the African countries after centuries of predation by the slave trade, colonialism, and neocolonialism. Careless assaults on the sovereignty of African countries are, therefore, tantamount to inflicting fresh wounds on the destiny of the African peoples. The African appeal can be found in the Indian Journal Frontline, but was mostly unheard in the West. That comes as no surprise. Africans are unpeople, to adapt George Orwell's term for those unfit to enter history. On March 12, the Arab League gained the status of people by supporting UN Resolution 1973. But approval soon faded when the League withheld support for the subsequent Western bombardment of Libya. And on April 10, the Arab League reverted to unpeople by calling on the UN also to impose a no-fly zone over Gaza and to lift the Israeli siege, virtually ignored. That too makes good sense. Palestinians are prototypical unpeople, as we see regularly. Consider the November/December issue of Foreign Affairs, which opened with 2 articles on the Israel-Palestine conflict. 1, written by Israeli officials Yosef Kuper-Wasser and Shalom Lipner, blamed the continuing conflict on the Palestinians for refusing to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Keeping to the diplomatic norm, states are recognized, but not privileged sectors within them. The second, by American scholar Ronald R. Krebs, attributes the problem to the Israeli occupation. The article is subtitled, "How the Occupation is Destroying the Nation." Which nation? Israel, of course, harmed by having its boot on the necks of unpeople. Another illustration, in October, headlines trumpeted the release of Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier who had been captured by Hamas. The article in the New York Times Magazine was devoted to his family's suffering. Shalit was freed in exchange for hundreds of unpeople, about whom we learned little, apart from sober debate as to whether their release might harm Israel. We also learned nothing about the hundreds of other detainees held in Israeli prisons for long periods without charge. Among the unmentioned prisoners are the brothers Osama and Mustafa Abu Muammar, civilians kidnapped by Israeli forces that raided Gaza City on June 24, 2006, the day before Shalit was captured. The brothers were then disappeared into Israel's prison system. Whatever one thinks of capturing a soldier from an attacking army, kidnapping civilians is plainly a far more serious crime unless, of course, they are mere unpeople. To be sure, these crimes do not compare with many others, among them the mounting attacks on Israel's Bedouin citizens, who live in southern Israel's Negev. They are again being expelled under a new program designed to destroy dozens of Bedouin villages to which they had been driven earlier. For benign reasons, of course. The Israeli cabinet explained that 10 Jewish settlements would be 28 because we say so. Founded there to attract a new population to the Negev. That is, to replace unpeople with legitimate people. Who could object to that? The strange breed of unpeople can be found everywhere, including the United States, in the prisons that are an international scandal, the food kitchens, the decaying slums. But examples are misleading. The world's population as a whole teeters on the edge of a black hole. We have daily reminders, even from very small incidents. For instance, last month, when Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives barred a virtually costless reorganization to investigate the causes of the weather extremes of 2011 and to provide better forecasts. Republicans feared that it might be an opening wedge for propaganda on global warming, a non-problem according to the catechism recited by the candidates for the nomination of what years ago used to be an authentic political party. Poor sad species. Anniversaries from Unhistory. February 4, 2012. George Orwell coined the useful term unperson for creatures denied personhood because they don't abide by state doctrine. We may add the term unhistory to refer to the fate of unpersons, expunged from history on similar grounds. The unhistory of unpersons is illuminated by the fate of anniversaries. Important ones are usually commemorated with due solemnity when appropriate, Pearl Harbor, for example. Some are not, and we can learn a lot about ourselves by extricating them from unhistory. Right now we are failing to commemorate an event of great human significance, the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's decision to launch the direct invasion of South Vietnam, soon to become the most extreme crime of aggression since World War II. Kennedy ordered the U.S. Air Force to bomb South Vietnam. By February 1962, hundreds of missions had flown. Authorized chemical warfare to destroy food crops so as to starve the rebellious population into submission, and set in motion the programs that ultimately drove millions of villagers into urban slums and virtual concentration camps, or strategic hamlets. There the villagers would be protected from the indigenous guerrillas whom, as the administration knew, they were willingly supporting. Official efforts at justifying the attacks were slim, and mostly fantasy. Typical was the president's impassioned address to the American Newspaper Publishers Association on April 27, 1961, where he warned that we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. At the United Nations on September 25, 1961, Kennedy said that if this conspiracy achieved its ends in Laos and Vietnam, the gates will be opened wide. The short-term effects were reported by the highly respected Indochina specialist and military historian Bernard Fall No Dove, but one of those who cared about the people of the tormented countries. In early 1965 he estimated that about 66,000 South Vietnamese had been killed between 1957 and 1961, and another 89,000 between 1961 and April 1965, mostly victims of the U.S. client regime or the crushing weight of American armor, napalm, jet bombers, and finally vomiting gases. The decisions were kept in the shadows, as are the shocking consequences that persist. To mention just one illustration, Scorched Earth, by Fred Wilcox, the first serious study of the horrifying and continuing impact of chemical warfare on the Vietnamese, appeared a few months ago and is likely to join other works of unhistory. The core of history is what happened. The core of unhistory is to disappear. What happened? By 1967, opposition to the crimes in South Vietnam had reached a substantial scale. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops were rampaging through South Vietnam, and heavily populated areas were subjected to intense bombing. The invasion had spread to the rest of Indochina. The consequences had become so horrendous that Bernard Fall forecast that Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity is threatened with extinction, as the countryside literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed on an area of this size. When the war ended 8 devastating years later, mainstream opinion was divided between those who called it a noble cause that could have been won with more dedication. Anniversaries from unhistory. And at the opposite extreme, the critics, to whom it was a mistake that proved too costly. Still to come was the bombing of the remote peasant society of northern Laos, executed with such magnitude that victims lived in caves for years to try to survive, and shortly afterward the bombing of rural Cambodia, which surpassed the level of all Allied bombing in the Pacific theater during World War II. In 1970, U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger had ordered a massive bombing campaign in Cambodia. Anything that flies on anything that moves, a call for genocide of a kind rarely found in the archival record. Laos and Cambodia were secret wars, in that reporting was scanty and the facts are still little known to either the general public or even educated elites, who nonetheless can recite by heart every real or alleged crime of official enemies. Another chapter in the overflowing annals of unhistory. In 3 years we may or may not commemorate another event of great contemporary relevance, the 900th anniversary of the Magna Carta. This document is the foundation for what historian Margaret E. McGuinness, referring to the Nuremberg trials, hailed as a particularly American brand of legalism, punishment only for those who could be proved to be guilty through a fair trial with a panoply of procedural protections. The Great Charter declares that no free man shall be deprived of rights except by the lawful judgment of his peers, and by the law of the land. The principles were later broadened to apply to men generally. They crossed the Atlantic and entered into the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, which declared that no person can be deprived of rights without due process and a speedy trial. The founders of course did not intend the term person to actually apply to all persons. Native Americans were not persons. Neither were those who were enslaved. Women were scarcely persons. However, let us keep to the core notion of presumption of innocence, which has been cast into the oblivion of unhistory. A further step in undermining the principles of the Magna Carta was taken when President Obama signed the National Defense Authorization Act, which codifies Bush-Obama practice of indefinite detention without trial under military custody. Such treatment is now mandatory in the case of those accused of aiding enemy forces during the War on Terror, or optional if those accused are American citizens. The scope is illustrated by the first Guantanamo case to come to trial under President Obama, that of Omar Khadr, a former child soldier accused of the heinous crime of trying to defend his Afghan village when it was attacked by U.S. forces. Captured at age 15, Khadr was imprisoned for 8 years in Bagram and Guantanamo, then brought to a military court in October 2010, where he was given the choice of pleading not guilty and staying in Guantanamo forever, or pleading guilty and serving only 8 more years. Khadr chose the latter. Many other examples illuminate the concept of terrorist. One is Nelson Mandela, only removed from the terrorist list in 2008. Another was Saddam Hussein. In 1982, Iraq was removed from the list of terrorist supporting states so that the Reagan administration could provide Hussein with aid after he invaded Iran. Accusation is capricious, without review or recourse, and commonly reflecting policy goals in Mandela's case, to justify President Reagan's support for the apartheid state's crimes. In defending itself against one of the world's more notorious terrorist groups, Mandela's African National Congress. All better consigned to unhistory.